Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. And this weekend I kind of did over the last week really, I did a project where I'm getting into learning how to do single page applications. And in the General Assembly bootcamp that I'm in, we're learning AngularJS. So that's the older 1.7 earlier version of Angular, which is very different than its current incarnation, Angular 8. And we'll learn React later on. But I really wanted to kind of try out all the main platforms or frameworks for creating single page applications, whether they're really front-end frameworks like React, Angular, or Vue, or whether they're compilers like Svelte and Stencil. So a while ago, I created a headless blog. Now, what does that mean? There's now a new slew of what's called a headless CMS. So essentially, it's like how WordPress would manage all your blog posts and all your data in a database. The thing is that a WordPress CMS does the whole thing. It also renders the website for you through, whatever WordPress theme you have, and renders the page. A headless CMS doesn't render the website for you. It just manages the data and then serves the data via API endpoints. So this way you can host your actual, front end of your website anywhere and use any framework that you want. You just pull the data from the API and do what you want with it. So I figured So I took that blog a while ago when I was trying to learn how to do sort of AJAX and API requests using the Fetch API. I was playing with that blog, and I figured, this would be a good opportunity to try these front-end frameworks instead of just, now I know how to fetch data just fine, but the question is, how would I use each one to create a basic front-end? So I wasn't trying to get super in-depth with the features of each of these frameworks, but just kind of learn how to do the basics, which means, okay, make the AJAX requests, which the question becomes, is there a special way? So something like Angular has its own sort of HTTP service that allows you to bring in those through observables, while many of the others, you would just use kind of standard fetch requests. Or you could use Axios or use whatever jQuery, whatever preferred sort of method of making that request that you want. There wasn't sort of a prescribed one. But then the question becomes, where do I do it? So this becomes a question of lifecycle methods. So are there lifecycle methods? How do I access those lifecycle methods? Which means functions that trigger or actions that trigger during different parts of the component's lifestyle. So I would have to learn that, because what I would want is I would want to make my fetch request prior to the component or when the component is loading, so the data is available when the component renders. And again, each framework has a slight different flavor, slight different syntax on how to do that. And then also taking that data and iterating it to create several instances of a component. So some of these frameworks have built-in iterators. So Vue, Svelte, and Angular all had sort of built-in ways of making loops, whether you're doing like an ng for, or for Vue, it was like, starts with V, I forget the prefix, I think it's just like Vue for or foo loop. And then with Svelte, it was just each. And so I would have to learn how to use that iterator that's built into the templating versus Stencil and React, where you're basically using JSX, which means you can interpolate certain levels of certain standard JavaScript. So I would just use like a map function or for each function and iterate over an array of data. So that was the challenge with each of these, figuring out all these different pieces and creating a very basic front end. I wasn't creating anything fancy. They're all responsive though. So I'll link to the blog post where actually you can see the links to all 5 versions. One, it gave me a better idea of what the workflow for each one, which I'm going to go over in just a moment. And also just a learning experience to kind of learn how each one worked and whatnot. So if I were to list from sort of what I felt was the easiest to the most difficult, I would say probably easiest was probably the newest one, Svelte. Svelte was really easy to pick up. Like that one, I probably literally went from knowing nothing about Svelte to actually having a fully functioning front end about 30 minutes. Like most of the syntax is pretty straightforward, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. There really is very minimal sort of additional syntax, and there's very minimal configuration. It just kind of works. And the reason it can do that is because it's compiled. So instead of it having to kind of it can kind of work around a lot of, the great thing about when you compile code is that you can kind of do things differently. You're not within the constraints of sort of the originating language. You can just parse things and splice things however you want, and then have the end result that is compliant with the language you're compiling to or your compiling target. Why transpilers are so popular for things like CoffeeScript and whatnot. Cool. But Svelte was really easy to pick up. I enjoyed the results. I enjoyed just the whole workflow. It was really easy to create a component, style it, do functions, do loops. It was just really easy. I can definitely see why Svelte has grown very quickly in the short amount of time that it's been out. And I won't be surprised about that growth going forward. The next easiest, theoretically, React should be the next easiest. It's actually the one I ended up struggling with the most, just due to sort of very minor syntax issues, with just sort of mainly constructing state, because I had already recently done Stencil, and Stencil also uses JSX, but the way you declare your state's different. Okay, so in React, you declare your state as an object, and state being sort of your internal variables that aren't accessed outside of the state, versus props being variables you pass into the component. It was just kind of relearning the syntax, and it was probably more because I was rushing it at the time, because I had learned React before, but it's been a while, so I kind of rushed it, so I ended up having to spend more time than I probably really needed to. But the thing about React is that there's really a bajillion ways to do anything. It's a very sort of minimalist framework, in the same way like Express is for backend. React is kind of in for front end, where how do you want to make your fetch request? Cool. Should this component be a function or a class? Well, what do you think? Do you want to make a component for every page or a component for every UI element? How granular do you want your components to be or need to be? And do you want to use lifestyle functions? It's very, very sort of whatever way you want, which is really cool. Okay, it allows you to kind of mold it to whatever problem you have, but also, when you're just trying to do something really quickly and learn it really quickly, makes it where you have to kind of discover a little bit more and just play around a little bit. But I like React, and I plan on getting really deep into React because I would like to eventually learn React Native, and get deeper into Gatsby, which is actually what I'm working on right now. Cool. So that's React. Then I would say but Vue was actually really easy to pick up. People always talk about how Vue is really easy to pick up. It is, because basically every component is really just a file, and then basically the file has three pieces: it's styling, it's script, and it's HTML. And then you configure everything in the script part, you style everything in the style part, and then in your template part you sketch out your component. So that part was pretty easy once I figured out how to configure or the setup of the component, which didn't take too long to figure out. So that one pretty quick. Stencil, I really like Stencil. I think it takes a lot of the best parts of Angular and React and makes a nice, better workflow. One of the things I like about Angular is sort of the way it organizes its file structure, and like every component gets a folder, and every component has its own CSS file and whatnot. Well, in React, I did that. I made like a file and a CSS for each component, but they weren't inherently organized into a folder. It was up to me to decide how I wanted to organize my files. While in Angular and Stencil, I could just use the CLI, say, hey, generate a new component, all the folder structures all set. It's nice and tidy, okay? And I really like the use of TypeScript, in the sense that it helped me become more deliberate in my programming, having to make sure that all my types were correct. One of the things that definitely took me a while to figure out is that I had a variable that was an array, it was an object, it was an array with objects in it. Problem is that that object had other stuff in it, and it kept throwing me errors, so eventually I realized the solution was to declare it as a array with anything in it. So, it's just little things like that, while a nuisance initially, because, if you're just working in straight JavaScript, you really just don't have to worry about that. I do feel like it helped me become more deliberate in how I select my data and made my code cleaner to have to declare it with decorators. And then also I like that. It's just really clear about where my props are, what my and what my state is, because I declare it with the decorator before the actual JSX. So that's the other thing with Stencil. So you use TypeScript very much like Angular to kind of declare your variables, to declare your functions, kind of lay out your lifecycle methods, but then you use JSX in the bottom. So again, everything is kind of typed up very similar to HTML. You could use like the map function and higher order array functions to iterate. And it was not bad at all. Okay, it was pretty straightforward to get that. One thing that seemed easier is that when I'm in Stencil, the map function, as far as my ability to iterate, I was able to do more versus like in React, it seemed like I had to kind of make it where when I iterated, it only returned, like my map function only returned one element. So essentially I had to create a component basically that took props. So basically it would map this component over and over again and assign props, and then define the deeper level of that iteration inside another component. While in Stencil, my map function worked just fine with me defining all the HTML tags in that map function. And there are slight differences between how JSX works in Stencil versus how JSX works in React. And then there's Angular. Angular used to scare me because it's got a lot of bells and whistles. But I found a really good tutorial. It really helped take a lot of the fear on there. I was able to kind of scope out, okay. And then plus being in the process of doing Angular.js in Bootcamp, a lot of the directives still transfer over that just used differently. So that made life a lot easier, but it wasn't that bad. I do enjoy a lot of the bells and whistles, like being able to have like really easily conditional styles, conditional displays with really little effort. I can just be like, oh, ng show, there's my variable, and then I just toggle that variable somewhere else, or ng class, and again, just toggle these variables elsewhere, and things just change without having to do too much setup otherwise with other types of DOM manipulation. So I found a lot of those bells and whistles really nice, but of course, again, Angular does have a sort of a higher ramp up of learning. Like there's a lot of setup you have to learn, and it's the same thing. That's why I like Stencil. Stencil has that sort of setup like Angular, but with the JSX of React, both of those, it takes the parts that I felt easier to learn from both, and done them in more interesting ways and allows you to compile it. But Svelte by far definitely is the easiest thing to pick up. Like literally you could pick that up in like 20 minutes and be pretty comfortable with it. But all five I like. I feel comfortable. If it were up to me, I'd probably work, if I could choose what I'm working in, it'd probably be Stencil. It just seemed, again, combination of the parts I liked about Angular and the combination of the parts I liked about React, with still a lot of vanilla JavaScript malleability. But they were all pretty cool. They all do the same thing and allowing you to make a progressive web application. And then again, with Svelte and Stencil, you can actually even create components that are agnostic to framework. While, if you're creating a component in Vue, it's got to be used in Vue. You're creating a component in React, it's got to be used in React, etc. With Stencil and Svelte, since they're compilers, you can compile it and then into native vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which I think is very cool. Cool. So now I'm going to get back to working on learning about Gatsby.js, which allows you to sort of server-side render your sort of single-page application in React and then serve it. So that way you can be pulling in data from all sorts of different places, whether it be Markdown files, CSV files, JSON, etc. Pull in data from many different places, turn it into one sort of GraphQL API, which then distributes all that data to a template that renders a React single-page application that gives you the benefits, gives the end user the benefits of the single-page application, but the dynamic information that could be done on the server side. So I'm gonna go play with that. And again, like Gatsby.js, the reason why that's cool is because this is something that people who can use, who like existing CMSs like WordPress, and say, you know what, I like my WordPress interface. I like working with the WordPress backend and this user interface in the back. But man, I would really like a React single-page application in the front just to give a little bit smoother user experience. Gatsby.js is kind of like that solution. It'll allow you to basically interact with the data from your different sources and create that sort of smoother UI experience. So figure it's worth learning. So I'll talk to you guys later. Have a great day and enjoy.